Thanks, JW. Maybe Lindsay should have done this introduction. Oh, no. Sid McAnnally is the president and chief executive officer of One Gas, which serves 2.2 million natural gas customers across Kansas, Oklahoma, and Texas. He joined the company in 2015 as the senior vice president of operations. He's promoted to chief operating officer in 2020 and became the CEO and president in June of 2021. He has a law degree from Alabama and a bachelor's degree from Auburn. Now that's his official bio, but I'm sorry, Sid, that's not how I'm going to introduce you. If you were in Birmingham or in Alabama before 2015, you probably know Sid's name, and you may know him personally. In fact, I suspect that most of the people in the room have had some contact with Sid. And if you know him personally, you know he has a deep understanding of Alabama politics and public policy. He's a deep thinker, but on more than just policy and petroleum products. I suspect that Sid could give you a 20-minute nuanced discussion on just about any topic from music to fiction to the current state of the media. Really, ask him anything, and I guarantee you, you will be impressed. Now, for those of you who are new to Alabama, haven't had an opportunity to meet Sid, he chaired the Leadership Alabama Board. He served on the boards of the Civil Rights Institute and Children's of Alabama. He was chief of staff at Auburn. He was a policy advisor to 2 Alabama governors, and he was a shareholder at Maynard Cooper, which is where I first got to know Sid and worked closely with him as he and I designed the external affairs function at Regions, combining corporate communications, governmental affairs, economic development, and diversity, all things that are in Sid's wheelhouse. And I like to think that maybe he took some of the learnings from that process to Energen Corp, where he was the head of external affairs and strategic planning, later assuming the role of head of customer service and marketing for Alagasco, their utility sub. I first heard Sid speak, I think it was in 2003, at an Alabama Press Association convention. It's hard to believe that's been 20 years now. And I was taken by not just his grasp of public policy, but his ability to make a really convincing argument on a very, very unpopular topic, which was raising taxes. And I have to say that it was probably the single best speech I had ever heard at a press association convention. But let's be honest, that's a really low bar. This was not Davos on Perdido Key. So Sid, the bar's a little higher here today, but you're among friends. Please join me in welcoming my friend, Sid McAnnally.
Well, thank you, Rick and JW. And Lindsay, thanks for returning the belts. That was a long time ago. It's so good to be in Birmingham. I mean, I don't know how many of you have lived here and then moved away and had the chance to come and just be back in town, just the way the town feels. So I was coming into town last night and I was driving to my dinner and I felt like something was missing. It was about 5 o'clock and I couldn't figure out, there was just something that wasn't right. And I realized I was on 280 and traffic was moving. It was not like it was when I left Birmingham. I've been asked to talk today about energy policy and kind of the energy decisions that lie in front of us, and also to talk a bit about our company. So let me quickly do that, and I think Rick did a fine job, so I'm not going to belabor this. One Gas is a natural gas utility company that serves customers in Kansas, Oklahoma, and Texas. We are publicly traded on the New York Stock Exchange. We picked up 100,000 customers since Rick's introduction, at 2.3 million customers now across those 3 states. We have a very wide service territory, but we're lucky that most of our customers are in metro areas that include Kansas City, Wichita, Topeka in Kansas, Oklahoma City and Tulsa in Oklahoma, and Austin and El Paso in Texas. So we've got a lot of growth. You may have read articles about the in-migration that's happened in the center of the country after COVID. And we thought that might be temporary, but it's fascinating how permanent that in-migration has been, and we're seeing enormous growth in our service territory. But what I really want to share with you about the utility business is true for Spire, it was true at Alagasco, and it's so good to see so many friends from Alagasco here, people that I worked with and had a chance to learn from. And that is the incredible dedication that these people have to their work. Whether it's Alabama Power on the electric side or Spire on the gas side for your service in Birmingham, these are people who are so dedicated to making sure that you have safe and reliable energy. And it's something that we all tend to take for granted until it's gone. And we've seen that in some storms recently where there were extended periods of outage. And so I just want you to understand that the folks that you see in trucks or working in yards or in call centers, they do tremendous work, and we ought to be grateful for their work. I want to make a pretty simple argument as we go through our few minutes together today. And that is that energy systems are complicated, that change takes time. And I'm going to talk about one of those changes that took about 20 years. And that the U.S. has a tremendous opportunity in front of us if we're wise enough to work together and have thoughtful energy policy. In 2001, actually it was March 13, 2001, Mike Warren gave this speech to this club. I checked with both Dudley Reynolds and Gary Youngblood. They were both here for it. They worked for Mike, so they might not have had a choice. But this is the speech that Mike gave, and it's so interesting because Mike was speaking to a time when energy supply had gone down because demand had gone down, and that pushed prices up. He was talking about the fact that natural gas is a pass-through for gas utilities, so they don't make money when prices go up. But interestingly, he also talked about the fact that there was not enough natural gas to serve the domestic needs of the United States. And so companies, including El Paso, which had recently purchased Southern Natural Gas, a company that was headquartered in Birmingham, many of you will remember. El Paso was going to build natural gas import facilities, importing liquefied natural gas, because we didn't have enough to supply our own needs. What Mike couldn't have known, because very few people knew it at the time, was there was a fella in Texas named George Mitchell, who was the son of Greek immigrants, owned a mid-sized natural gas company. But George Mitchell had been convinced for years that there was a way to open up the resource that was in shale rock all across the United States. For decades, geologists had known this resource existed and that there were enormous amounts of natural gas and oil in this rock, but nobody could figure out how to open it and extract that resource. But he was convinced it could be done. And he bet his company in 2001, about the same time Mike was speaking, that he could crack the code. And he did. And then another company called Devon, headquartered in Oklahoma City, started to see this amount of natural gas coming out of an area that it shouldn't be coming out of, and knew that something had changed. And so they bought George Mitchell's company. And they combined it with a process called horizontal drilling, where you drop a pipe, instead of straight down, you turn the pipe into a formation of oil or natural gas and can extract a lot of fuel. In 2001, shale gas was less than 1% of the amount of natural gas that we used in the United States. By 2011, it was up to 25%. Last year, it was over 50%. So a dramatic change in the energy supply for our country. And all of those facilities that were built to bring natural gas into the country because we didn't have enough to serve our own needs were reversed to export natural gas because the amount of gas being produced had changed so dramatically. So what does that have to do with oil? Well, there was also oil trapped in that shale rock. And we had just as dramatic a change in our oil supply. In 2008, we were importing about 60% of the oil that we use domestically in the United States. Today, we are the largest producer of oil in the United States, thanks to that same technology that George Mitchell pioneered in 2001. So why does this matter to you? How could this possibly be relevant? We're at another crossroads right now. We're at a time when there is a goal to lower carbon emissions, but to try to find a way to do that that doesn't undercut the reliability and the price stability of the energy that we have today. So the question is, How do we do that? We're seeing an object lesson right now in Western Europe, where Western Europe moved very quickly away from traditional energy sources and toward renewables. And their bet was they could take natural gas from Russia to fill the gap. But because of geopolitical conflict, that gas is not coming into Western Europe. And in 2022, we saw price inflation in Western Europe that topped out at 40%, 40%. So now we see the Europeans building natural gas import facilities. Germany just finished their first one. It cost about $10 billion. They plan to build 4 more, and that's just Germany. So the question is, how can we manage a transition in a meaningful way, but not expose ourselves to cost, to price instability, or to energy instability? So to do that, I thought we might look at some information. The first is looking at total energy demand by source. So this looks at, for the globe and the United States, where does our energy come from and what's the trajectory of the growth of that energy? If you look at the world, you see that there has been a pretty steep up and to the right move in the amount of energy that's being used across the globe. You also see that while natural gas has increased to meet that demand, the primary mover has been coal. And so we see growth globally in energy demand, but we also see a growing coal use, which creates upward pressure on CO2 emissions. If you shift over to the US, it's an interesting and different story. If you start down from the bottom, you see that our gas supply goes up in a significant way, and that 1990 is the beginning of oil production that was traditional. And then you get into 2010, you start to see the lift from shale gas in 2010. You also see the growth of renewables, which is meaningful. But look at what happens to coal. Fuel switching means that we don't have to use as much coal, particularly for electric generation, which has a positive impact on our CO2 emissions. We also had a stability in pricing. So if you look at the decade from 2010 to 2019, we saw consumer prices go up 19%, but energy prices only go up 12%. So we had a 7% real inflation savings because of this change in our energy profile. If you look at the next slide, I just want to illustrate the impact that COVID had on demand. In Mike Warren's speech, if you go back and read it, it talks a lot about supply and demand, and the impact of demand falls, which encourages producers to take supply offline, and how long it takes supply to catch up. So this is just about demand. And look, in both the global demand and the US demand, we see this incredible drop. But if you were on the phone like I was, trying to understand what's the trajectory of this going to be, most of the predictions were that we would have a U-shaped recovery. We're going to go down, we're going to bottom out, and then we're going to see a slow rise back up to where we were pre-COVID. Instead, we had this dramatic and very narrow V, where we saw demand for oil, but also demand for everything else, fall precipitously and then pop right back up. Well, that created a situation where you didn't have as much supply when demand had picked back up, and it takes supply a while to catch up. So a pretty clear picture about what happened. But the good part of the story is we recovered very quickly in terms of how we were able to react. The next slide looks at that. So this slide looks at production. Starting with crude oil, our production, you see the drop from COVID in early 2020, and then you see production start to catch up. What you don't see is a quick V back up, because it takes a while to get natural gas and oil production back online. I included this slide about imports because I wanted to illustrate the fact that since 2010, we've been importing less and less and less oil, which is a good story from an energy independence standpoint. But we have been increasing our oil imports from Canada. So we still import some oil based on the way that our refinery stack works. Glad to talk about that if you want to talk about it in questions. But the fact that we're importing from Canada de-risks the fact that we are importing some oil, because we're importing in the continent and we're importing from an ally. If you look at reserves, this really kind of tells you a story that usually doesn't show up in the graphs in the newspaper. And that is the gray shade here shows you the high low for each year between 2015 and 2019. So it's given you a band to think about what was the performance in the previous decade. The red line shows you where we actually are in 2022 coming out of COVID. And you see that we haven't quite caught up in crude stores. We clipped the bottom of that curve late in the year, but by November, we were back under our traditional run. So we hope to see that come back up. Gasoline and ethanol caught up, and you've seen the pricing. Everybody's reactive to the price of gasoline at the pump. And it's remarkable that gasoline has fallen as quickly as it has, given the disruption that we all faced. Diesel is still under. If you have a business that's exposed to diesel, as I do, then you are very attentive to diesel pricing. And we also are seeing some scarcity in diesel. So it's something we want to keep an eye on. The good news in the chart is what's happened to natural gas. Because we've had a fairly warm year so far in 2022, and we've had a lot of production come online. We see that line come back up to the midpoint late in the year in 2022, and gas prices are back. The pricing today at market open was $3.72, which is a very favorable gas price, something that's good for all of us. If you look at pricing, which is really what most of you probably care about, this shows you the pricing from 2010 to 2022 for crude oil, natural gas, gasoline, and diesel. And I want to point to a couple of things about this chart because there are two very interesting things. The first is look at the crude oil chart and what happened in April of 2020. Oil went negative. So for one day, April 20th, 2020, if you could find the right contract, you had the opportunity to have an oil producer pay you $37 to take a barrel of gasoline, a barrel of oil off their hands. Oil contracts went negative. Now, as you would imagine, that didn't last very long. A lot of people jumped on that trade and oil popped right back up. But it goes to show the volatility that we all faced coming out of COVID and the uncertainty. And the other thing that happened that was interesting that caused that dip in crude is the Russians and OPEC were trying to figure out how they wanted to respond to COVID, and they didn't come to an agreement. The Saudis decided to increase production significantly, and that's what pulled the trigger on that hit below zero. Gasoline, you're all familiar with gas prices. They've stabilized now around $2, $2.50, depending on the kind of gas that you use. Diesel spikes up, it's still elevated. But I wanted to talk a bit about natural gas because this illustrates a couple of things. First, look at the pricing in 2010. So when Mike Warren was speaking to this club, to Gary and Dudley and others of you who might have been here, gas prices were about $6 per MMBTU. And then you start to see shale gas come into the picture, and you see for a period of 2012 to 2020, 2021, a very stable price deck for natural gas between $2 and $4. That stability allowed us to build a significant petrochemical industry in the United States, to onshore businesses that had left the country. It made a big difference for us in a number of fronts. And then just as oil production hit its peak in January of 2020, COVID happens and you have the supply drop, and suddenly you've got a demand supply dislocation and prices start to climb as you would expect them to. Then we have the Russian invasion of Ukraine and all the headlines that you all read about the fact that Western Europe was exposed to natural gas imports from Russia. And for the first time, we started to see natural gas be priced at a global level. Gas has always been priced locally because it's produced locally, it's piped to wherever it's used, and so you have local basins. But for the first time, speculators came into the market and started betting on the price of natural gas as it related to LNG exports to Europe. That's moderated a bit. As I said, we've seen pricing come back down with inventories, but it's something to keep an eye on. We've talked a little bit about natural gas production, so I wanted to give you a very quick slide about natural gas production. If you look at that slide, you see that in 2010, we were running about 60 BCF a day, and that's essentially doubled in the time frame between the two. And almost all of that gas is shale gas. That has impacted not just pricing for us as consumers, it's impacted things like natural gas liquids that go into plastics or go into heating with propane or go into fuel additives with butane. So those things make a difference. But look at the liquefied natural gas net exports. So let me give you just a 1 minute on LNG. Liquefied natural gas is natural gas that's been super cooled to negative 260 degrees. When it hits negative 260, it goes to a liquid form, and you can take more natural gas for transport. So it drops to about 1/300th of its gaseous volume. That's what happens. So when you see these tankers that leave the country to go to Western Europe, that's what's happening is natural gas has been liquefied, it's transported, and then it's regasified at a port when it reaches Europe. We were exporting LNG because we had so much natural gas before COVID and before Ukraine. So that downward spike shows you where COVID is, you see the recovery, but we go off the chart. This is the most recent chart, and we go off the chart at the top as exports to Europe start to grow exponentially. And we expect to see that number go up to 14, 15, 16 BCF a day in exports to Europe as Europe continues to need natural gas. And of course, that puts us in a position to support our allies. I want to move quickly to a couple of slides before making a closing comment. This slide looks at the pipeline infrastructure in the US. This is just the natural gas pipeline infrastructure. We also have pipelines for liquids. We've got a robust and mature pipeline system in the US. So you think about what had to happen for the shale gas revolution to happen. Well, you can have all the shale gas in the world you want, but if you can't move it to where you need to get it, it makes no difference. The fact that we had a very robust pipeline system in the United States meant that we had the ability to move natural gas very quickly and respond to this opportunity. That's been meaningful for us. We also built out some infrastructure, but it's becoming more and more difficult to add infrastructure as we're trying to get to parts of the country that are constrained. I also want to look at this slide, and I don't expect you to read this. It's an eye test, but if you care about how we use fuel in the United States, I want to encourage you to go to Google and Google Lawrence Livermore and energy map. So the Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory produces this map once a year. This is the 2021 map. They haven't published 2022 yet. And the reason I offer you this map is to say, if you can't put energy information in context, you really don't know what you think you know. And there's all sorts of information in the echo chamber right now about energy, and much of it is misleading unless you can put it into context. So this is a great way to contextualize information about energy. This map actually shows you for the entire United States, on the left side, the sources of fuel, and on the right side, the uses of the fuel. If you own a business, you're very familiar with sources and uses maps. This is a source and use map for energy. What it allows you to do is to see not what we're capable of, not what could be, but what are we actually using? And it gives you a sense of where we are today. It also gives you a sense of what it will take to move the very complex energy system from one place to another place. So I really encourage you to take some time with this map. I'll give you the headline, and the headline that it is that in 2021, about 80% of the energy that we used in the United States came from coal, natural gas, or oil. I often get this question, and Rick talked about books. I don't think you can read enough, but a lot of folks ask, what book could I read that would be a meaningful book about energy that's not trying to make one argument or another? And I would suggest this book that was written last year. Václav Smil is a Canadian professor. He's kind of made his career writing about energy. 15 years ago or so, he wrote the go-to energy book called Energy and Civilization. It's a history of energy across the world. This book looks at where we are today. And what Smil is trying to do is not make an argument to you about winners and losers. He's just trying to say, this is how we got to where we are. And this is what it will take to move us to a different kind of energy world. So if you have an interest in this, I encourage you to read it. I've given it to lots of employees, our board of directors, a lot of folks in our part of the world, and I strongly recommend it to you. It was on a lot of top 10 lists for the year. So why title a speech, the U.S. Energy Advantage? What I want to argue to you is we have three significant advantages. The first is we are resource rich in the United States. It's not anything we did. It's not anything we're responsible for. But the reality is we have a depth of resources that are unique globally. And that is true for hydrocarbons as well as renewables. You can go around the world and there are many places that are constrained in the way that they can deploy renewables. Not only do they not have the infrastructure to move electrons that are generated by renewables, but they have places that are too cloudy for solar. They have places that aren't windy enough for wind. And we're fortunate in this country that we have access really to both types of energy. There are exciting developments in offshore wind. Right now, 2 utilities on the East Coast are building windmills offshore, which is complex, but very promising. If you come to the Midwest, where I live today, you'll see thousands and thousands of windmills in Texas and Oklahoma and Kansas, states known for hydrocarbon production, but are also ripe for wind development. The second is we have robust infrastructure in the United States. We've got a built-out pipeline system that we've already looked at, and we've got a built-out grid. But the reality is, and I do not present myself as an expert on the electric grid. Our friends at Alabama Power and Southern Company are much more qualified to speak to this than I am. But it's important for all of us that we realize that if we're going to recognize the promise of renewables in the United States, we are going to have to add long-haul generation transmission. We simply don't have enough because renewables tend to be in places that are away from population centers. And so if you're going to have a meaningful renewable industry, you're going to have a way to move those electrons from where the renewable locations are to where people are going to use that energy. And that's going to mean that we've got to build out the grid in an organized and intentional way. Disappointingly, we're going in the wrong direction. So I just pulled these statistics yesterday. From 2012 to 2016, we averaged about 2,000 miles per year of high voltage build in the United States. From 2017 to 21, that fell to 700 miles a year. So we're adding renewables, but we're not adding the long haul transmission capacity that we need to add. We've got to do a better job of planning. The good news is we are making progress. We're already moving in the right direction. So this is a map that shows CO2 emissions by sector. So the top sector is the electric power generation sector. The second green sector is commercial usage. The blue band is industrial usage. The dark orange is agriculture. The light orange is residential. And the darker blue is transportation. So this is looking at where does CO2 come from and where are our opportunities. It's another good thing to peg to, because often we are thinking about changing the place that doesn't offer us the biggest yield in terms of CO2 reduction. So emissions of CO2 from just electric generation, if you start in 2005, which was our peak of CO2 emissions for electric generation, and go to 2020, we had a 36% reduction in the amount of CO2 that was emitted. That was primarily because we had shale gas, which is much less CO2 intensive than coal, but we also were adding renewables. And the reason I'm talking about renewables, which may surprise you from somebody that's in the business I'm in, is that for us to be successful, we've got to take advantage of all of these opportunities. We can't bounce around and not have meaningful policy. We can't hope that something will be true in the way that Western Europe hoped Russia would continue to supply them with natural gas. We've got to build a policy that makes sense across the board. But this is a very promising start. We also have a number of technologies that we can develop in the US. And I'm not going to speak to all of these. I'll just read over the top and be glad to speak to them if you have a specific question. Carbon capture and sequestration is absolutely going to be with us because hydrocarbons are going to be with us. Nobody that is really studying meaningfully what the energy path between now and 2050 thinks about, believes that we're going to do away with hydrocarbons. So the question is, how do we lower our carbon emissions? Energy efficiency is underway today. Direct air capture is in the research phase. Using geothermal energy, which is raising hot water and circulating hot water to heat buildings, is becoming more popular even in a residential setting. Renewable fuels like renewable natural gas, where you capture carbon that's escaping, convert it to a gas form and use it, reduces the carbon intensity, depending on who you listen to, by 20 to 25 times. So there are a number of promising technologies that we can take advantage of. But I'll leave you with this. Since 2010, developments in our energy system, supported by shale gas and shale oil, but not only by those two, has provided us with a level of energy independence and has had a positive economic impact on people who consume utility services across the United States. We're well positioned to meet the energy challenges before us, but only if we have the wisdom and the courage to build on the existing resources that we have, can reach across political aisles to have conversations about how we plan for the future. And if we can do that, we can maintain a level of reliability, we can maintain a level of affordability, and we can dramatically reduce the amount of carbon emissions. So I've tried to demonstrate to you that we have the resources. I've tried to demonstrate to you that we are a people who are innovative. Think about George Mitchell and a very small group of people in his company who believed they could unlock that shale resource. It wasn't the government that did it. It wasn't a big multinational corporation that did it. It was a guy in his office who had a vision and executed on that. And I want to argue to you that that can be true for carbon capture, and it can be true for battery technology, and it can be true for geothermal. It can be true for all of these resources. And because we are in the most innovative country in the world, we have an opportunity to realize that, but only if we have the wisdom to work together and find a pathway to have a meaningful energy policy that can take us forward. And that it will serve not only all of us, but our children and the grandchildren that I've had a chance to talk to many of you about as we've caught up today. So thanks for your time. Glad to take questions about this or other issues that you may have. I really appreciate it.